He asked me to come back, I answered the phone. Hello, who is it? A dog with his bone. My sharpening skills with the word is the flex, and it ain't about checks and my yes. The message, my passion still don't muzzle me while I'm fresh.
The conversation tonight, if you're coming in, make sure you like, make sure you hit subscribe, make sure you drop a comment, tell me you're in here. I saw it in the thumbnail. I want to talk about, can we judge? I want to talk about this idea of when individuals say in the church, specifically in the church, when individuals say the Bible tells you not to judge. I personally really think this is that statement is rooted in what I would call just a lack of desire to be held accountable. Just a lack of desire to be held accountable. Typically, there are times, obviously, where there's realistic judgment taking place, and we're going to talk about that. But there's other times when, man, that is really a statement that is made because there's either something being pressed upon somebody that they dislike, and so the way to kind of shut it down is, only God can judge me, and things like that, which is very true. I always tell people, and Hebrews makes it clear, like it is a scary thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So that's not the best solution to you're justifying living in an immoral life. Well, only God can judge me, and He will. That's why we're trying to warn you now so that you can escape the judgment that is to come in the last days as it relates to His wrath. But obviously, anytime we had this conversation, the conversation really begins in Matthew 7:1. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured unto you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and look, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your eye, out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. I hear it. It's like loud to me, but I got you. So now, obviously, this is a passage of scripture that many people kind of deal with. And I think if you just look at this, I think on the basic level, it doesn't take a lot of hermeneutics or a lot of exegetical or interpretive skills to identify that the clear subject here is the hypocritical judgment. And a couple of things that you can look at when you look at this passage is, he's saying don't judge so that you will not be judged. Now, here's the interesting thing. Like, this word judge is actually used over and over and over again. And a lot of times is referencing kind of this eschatological judgment that takes place. Here's the thing, though. When you think about judgment, we all know that God will judge, right? We know that God will judge every single person. But it's interesting that Paul kind of gives an allusion in Romans chapter 2 to the fact that there is a way to be removed from that judgment, right? So here we are. Here we have God judging everybody. But then Romans chapter 2 speaks in such a way. Let me get this a little bit bigger. Romans chapter 2 speaks in such a way where it says in Romans 1, you have no excuse, you foolish person, every one of you who passes judgment. For in the matter in which you judge someone else, you condemn yourself. Okay? For you who judge practice the same thing, right? So here's a hypocritical judgment, right? Hey, you doing the same thing that you're making judgment of someone else doing, which means in one sense, you're saying you condemn yourself because why? Because you're demonstrating by the nature of being able to call out what somebody else is doing that you understand this is wrong, and yet you are doing the exact same thing. Right. And this same thing doesn't actually necessarily have to mean the exact same thing. If you talk about the discrepancy between the Gentile and the Jews here, it's you practice immorality like them as well. Then he says in verse 2, and we know that the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things. So there's a right judgment that will fall upon those who practice, in this sense, evil things. But do you suppose this, you foolish person, who passes judgment on those who practice such things and yet does them as well, that you will what? Escape the judgment of God. So he's saying, hey, do you think that you'll be able to escape the judgment of God as you pass judgment on other people? Essentially, it's more of the question is more of an absolute. Hey, you know you're not going to be able to escape the judgment of God by judging other people, right? And instead, you are affirming this judgment on yourself. That's why he says you condemn yourself. Then he says in verse 4, or do you think lightly of the riches of his kindness and restraint and patience, not knowing, here it is, that the kindness of God leads you to repentance. But because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God. Here's what Paul brings a contrast with. You can lead, you can turn and repent and avoid this wrath on the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, or you can continue in your stubbornness and store up wrath. It seems to be that Paul is saying there is a certain way to store up wrath and judgment, and there's a way to avoid this wrath and judgment. But at the same time, we know that the scriptures in Revelations 21 talks about all will stand before Christ and there will be a judgment for all. And so that means, the reason I'm bringing that out is because that means that there is a way to have a judge. There is a way to be under judgment and not be under wrath or condemnation. And so if that is true, when Jesus is saying, do not judge so you will not be judged, he's talking about a specific type of judgment that none of us can make, especially when we're talking about those who are followers of Christ. That is a judgment on to condemnation, right? So in one sense, there's a difference that has to be made between, and I'm going to show you this when we get in 1 Corinthians 11, but there's a difference that has to be made between a judgment that is condemning a person, and that condemnation is a condemnation unto eternal death, the condemnation unto the wrath and fury of the Lord, the condemnation that comes at the second coming of Christ when he judges and eventually sets justice to everything that takes place in this world. There's a condemnation judgment. But then there is still a judgment that takes place that does not lead on to condemnation. And we see that in Revelations 20 and Revelations 20 and 21, where even the dead in Christ will raise and the book shall be open. Even First Corinthians 4 teaches that our works will be judged, every last one of us. 1 Corinthians 3. So look what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 10. According to the grace of God, which has been given me, like a wise master builder, I lay the foundation, and another is building on it. But each person must be careful how he builds on it. For no one can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, or straw, these are building materials. So there's a foundation, and then you're building the house on that foundation. But it's being built with either, right, gold, silver, precious stone, wood, hay, or straw. Each one's work will become evident, for the day will show it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire itself will test the quality of each one's work. This is talking about a judgment. If anyone's work which has been built on it remains, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burnt up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet only so as through fire. Notice what it's saying. This is what we call like standing in the judgment seat of Christ. There will be a judgment, but that judgment will not lead unto condemnation. There will be a suffering of a loss, but there will not be a suffering of eternal death, right? But things are going to be judged. God is going to examine. God is going to test. God is going to reveal at that time our works, the motives behind our works, and et cetera, et cetera. But it doesn't lead unto condemnation. So when it comes, and I'm keep 1 Corinthians 11 in mind when we get there to make all types of sense. But when we are judging, our judgment cannot be a judgment onto condemnation, for neither of us have the right to judge a person unto condemnation. Even Paul says, and I think it's 2 Corinthians 3 again, he says, judge nothing before it's time. Because even if you condemn an unbeliever, you don't need to condemn them, right? Because Christ didn't come into the world to condemn, what? Because they're condemned already. There's no condemnation you can place on them that has not already been placed on them. Instead, our word is not a word of condemnation. It is a word of salvation. Now, if they reject it, then the condemnation rests on them. We're not sitting there, I damn you to hell. Like, that's just not It's just not how we should be acting as followers of Christ. But notice though that Jesus can't be saying that we can't judge, because he sets a criteria. In the way that you judge, you will be judged, right? So in other words, he's simply saying, watch the level in which you judge, right? So again, there's not saying, and we'll see right in this text that he's not saying not to judge, but he's dealing with the type of judgment we have. And he's dealing with, one, making sure that we're not trying to condemn the followers of Christ in their actions. And two, making sure that we are ensuring that the criteria in which we judge, we're ready to deal with that criteria, because there will be a criteria. That criteria will weigh our own actions. This is why in James 2:13, James says this. James says in 2:13, he says, let's start at verse 12. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of freedom. For judgment will be merciless to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. James says, hey, if you are somebody who lacks mercy, he says, then you will find yourself also being judged according to that same standard that is merciless. Jesus says the same thing in Matthew 5 a little bit, but he said, blessed are the merciful, for they will receive what? Mercy, right? So again, the criteria that Jesus is getting at is, hey, make sure you're not judging unto condemnation. And hey, make sure that you set a criteria that you're willing to stand underneath yourself. And here's the thing about when he says this, here's what should be happening in our brains, those of us who are going to be judges of people, because judgment is not wrong. And I'll explain that in a minute. But here's the thing that we need to understand. Here's what this passage is meant to do. It's not meant to be abused by people to act like you can't ever say nothing about their sinful life. What it's meant to do is to say, make sure that you are careful, right? If you understand that you're going to be judged by the same criteria in which you judge other people, here's one thing you might want to make sure. Let me make sure I'm careful. And this is why even when Galatians 6:1 talks about restoring the spirit of gentleness, it's like, hey, make sure like you too may find yourself one day in a fallen condition, in a stumbling condition, in a season of vulnerability, and you have given into temptation more than you want. And so what Jesus is saying is, know this, if that day comes upon your life, however you judge them will be the same measure in which you are judged. So if you lack the ability to show mercy to somebody, when it's time for you to need mercy, that judgment will come back to you. And there will be a slowness or a lack thereof of mercy in your own life. It's meant to just make us always have a posture of humility, even when we're dealing with people who may be in a fallen state. I'm specifically dealing in the church realistically, but it's a broader sense, obviously, but it's meant to cause us to just be cautious, but never is it calling us to be silent, right? So he's laying out a criteria. Right. And then then the third thing that this text is meant to tell us is he says, why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and look, the log is in your own eye? Then he says, what? You hypocrite. Now you see this repetition of words. And anytime you see here's what people miss in this. The idea is meant to be a shock factor. Realistically, when you look at the language, the assumption here is not even that these are intentional hypocrites. Remember, Jesus is saying this, so it's really it's meant to bring awareness to self-deception. In other words, Jesus, the one who knows all, who examines all, who sees all, is saying, like, you trying to get a speck out your brother's eye, you know you got a log in yours. Hey, let me wake you up to the reality of who you are. Let me wake you up to the reality of what's going on in your life. And you got to think, when you're talking about and Jesus's interactions later on with the Pharisees and things, they missed that they had this. They were trying to come against Jesus for doing the simple things, and they missed the fact that they had this big, unloving, hypocritical, unjust law in their eye. Yet they're passing judgment on Christ for healing somebody on the Sabbath, for making sure that somebody that mercy was shown to somebody on the Sabbath. So in other words, it's like, here's a speck, even though Jesus wasn't breaking the law, but here's a speck. Do you understand how even in your judgment against my speck, You're demonstrating the log that is in your eye. For the whole law should be summed up in what? Love God with your whole heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. For I require mercy or over sacrifice. Or it's like, hold on, wait a minute. You're missing the bigger problem that's wrong with you, and you're demonstrating it by the fact that you're mad that I healed a man. You're mad that I healed a man, which means you don't even see how unloving you are, the bigger log that's in your eye. Jesus is really dealing with the self-deceived, because sometimes every hypocrite ain't a hypocritical judger because they are intentionally being hypocrite. Some people are so blinded by their own stuff, they need to be awakened to the fact, like, you low-key foul, right? And this whole idea of a plank is like this weight bearing building tool, right? It's the log that is carrying the weight of a room. And so, in other words, what Jesus is saying is, you got this lesser matter that you're judging a person's life by, but you got this weightier problem of your own that you're not dealing with, right? And again, if we were talking about Pharisees, it'd be like the lack of love and things like that. But again, it was never him saying that if you have sinned, you can't make a judgment on someone. By the way, let me just show this, because I didn't show this, because I want to, before I get too far. Let me just show this real quick. Right, when we look at this word judge, krino, it can mean literally judge in a judicial sense, to pass judgment on, to consider, to separate. The BDAG, one of the leading lexicons, saying it'll have it as to make a selection, to prefer something, to select something. You can pass judgment on something, or thereby speak to influence the lives and actions of others, express an opinion about. And that highlight meaning that's the senses that they're kind of saying that Matthew 7:1-8 is about, is to express an opinion about, or to pass a judgment on an action or something like that. And then it also can be an unfavorable judgment. It can be criticism. It can be finding fault. This is kind of the semantic range of what the word means. It doesn't mean all of these. And so the BDAG is holding more that the sense of, when we talk about this, and when we talk about a sense of a word, we talk about essentially, man, what is its usage? Like, what is its usage? So, like, if you was looking at if we were looking here, and I went to here, where's krino, right? You will see, you probably can't see that. I don't know how big it is, but the sense here means to be evaluated, right? This is our word krino, right? It means to be evaluated, or to be or become assessed or appraised by critical examination or scrutiny. Notice what the sense isn't. The sense isn't to condemn. Now, condemnation is part of the semantic range of this word, but you gotta allow, one of the things that I talk to people about, when you get into like word studies, people get into word studies and then they don't understand semantic range, they don't understand semantic field, and so they just do word studies all bad. They just pick whatever word they think is best, but no, right? There's an exegetical decision making that has to take place, because words have a range of meaning and they have a field of meaning. And so with that means that I have to allow the context of, that's why we always say in hermeneutics, definitions don't define words. What defines words? Context defines words. I have to understand what's taking place in the passage to make sure that I'm applying the proper word range that exists for this word. And so we know that he's saying, do not condemn so that you will not be condemned, because that's just not the measure that he's talking about. Because why? Because he doesn't actually say never judge, because look what he says in verse 5. First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Notice the language change. So you can take the speck out of your brother's eye. Well, what is the speck? Well, the speck is whatever this sin is that the person is doing. So even in that, Jesus says, wait a minute, I'm not asking you to not address the sin of your brother or your sister's life. But what I am saying is, make sure you deal with you. Make sure that you are not ignoring things in your life and just choosing. Because a lot of times what happens is people are so cloaked in sin that they'll pick on another person's sin to make themselves feel better about their sin. And what Jesus saying is that's hypocritical. The same way that you are telling your brother to work on their stuff and calling out themselves to correction, make sure you apply that to your own life. Make sure you're working on your stuff, making sure that you're responding to correction. But he never was saying, even in this passage, he never says you cannot judge. He simply says, hey, don't judge so that you will not be judged. For in the same measure you judge, you will be judged. In other words, he's dealing with a type of judgment, right? What is the type of judgment? Hypocritical judgment, right? But then he says, hey, but if you take the speck, if you can get the log out your own eye, you'll be able to clearly see to do what? To take the speck out of your brother's eye. What does that mean? Well, that means that the idea of the judgment that Christ is talking about is a judgment that is meant to correct, purge, purify, not one that is meant to condemn. Why? Because you're still taking the speck out of your brother's eye. You're not leaving it in there and then condemning that person to blindness. No, you are speaking what you need to speak in order to remove something from your brother's eye so that they are no longer blind, that they can see, right? So it's not to place them in a state of forever condemnation. Rather, it's an act that is meant to clear the thing out of their life. And so this is what Jesus is kind of getting at here. And I'll explain it some more. But before, one of the things that we always hear in relationship to this is we always hear this idea that most people, they'll partner. I don't even know if the word that I should be using is partner, but they'll partner this Matthew 7 and they'll partner it with, you who have the first, you who are without sin, cast the first stone, right? And so they'll partner with that John 8 passage. And I just want to acknowledge that again, because people do this and it's just disingenuous because here's the reality. You do not have to be sinless to be able to address the sin of another, right? If that was the case, there's no ability for anybody anywhere ever to ever address or call out anything because all of us are imperfect. None of us are sinless, right? So it's this whole idea that, well, if you don't have any sin, then you can now make judgment or cast the first stone. Well, here's the problem. First and foremost, the casting of the stone was unto death, right? The casting of the stoning was a stoning unto death. So the stoning was what? A condemnation. And so what would Jesus really be saying? He will be saying, listen, you can't condemn. You who are imperfect have no ability to condemn somebody else. Why? Because you're not perfect. And for those of us who are followers of Christ, he bore our condemnation. So how dare you have your condemnation bore by him and then go forth and then start to condemn other people? How can a condemned person condemn somebody else, right? Though your condemnation has been removed, how dare you go now and place that condemnation on somebody else? It's backwards. It doesn't make any sense. But if you look at this John 8 passage, notice something that people really, I don't even know why, but it's not really a difficult passage, right? Obviously, the scribes and Pharisees brought a woman caught in the act of adultery and they placed her in the center of the courtyard, right? And they said to him, teacher, this woman has been caught in the very act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What then do you say? Now they are saying this to test him so that they may have grounds for accusing him. But Jesus stooped down with his finger and wrote on the ground. We have no clue what he wrote on the ground. When they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and said to them, he who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone. And again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Now, when they heard this, they began leaving one by one, beginning with the older ones. And he was left alone, and the woman was there in the center of the courtyard. This is the popular phrase, he who is without sin, let him. Here's the problem with that, right? What Jesus is saying there is not he who is without any sin ever in this world, go ahead and cast the first stone. That's not what he's saying. How do I know? Well, understand, it said that they caught the woman in adultery, right? So the first problem is that there's a problem with their understanding of the law as they come to Jesus and they say to Jesus, she was caught in adultery, and the law says we should stone her. It does. But what does the full law say? Deuteronomy 22 and 22. If a man is found sleeping with a married woman, then both of them shall die. Notice, both of them shall die. The man who slept with the woman and the woman, so you shall eliminate the evil from Israel. Notice again, if a man is found sleeping with a married woman, that's adultery, then both of them shall die. The man who slept with the woman and the woman, so you shall eliminate the evil from Israel. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem is simple. The problem is you said that she was caught in the act, but where is the man? Because if you caught her in the act, understand, to catch somebody in the act of adultery means you had to catch her and him. So why have you not brought the man? Okay, 2 reasons why. Either you didn't catch her in the act. She is an adulterous woman. We know that. Either you didn't catch her in the act, or guess what? Your judgment is unjust. It's unjust. It's not fair. It's rooted in favoritism because you forgot somebody, right? So they quote the law, but notice they quote half the law. The law says such women, when they do so, should be stoned. Yeah, no, but the law says such women and man. So they're already coming with a half truth of the law. How many people give a half biblical truth? And we be following that and falling into the trap. But here's the beauty of why we need to have the word of God stored up in our heart. Jesus don't fall for this. Jesus don't fall for this. And here's what he's saying when he says, he who is without sin among you, let him be the first to cast stone. He's not saying you who have never, ever, ever in your life sinned, cast the first stone. That's not what he's saying. Instead, what he's actually saying is he's quoting another aspect of the law that they had seemed to forget. Exodus 23 and 1 and 2. Notice what Exodus says. You shall not give a false report. Do not join your hand with a wicked person to be a malicious witness. So you got a crowd of people and they're saying, hey, we caught this woman in the act. We're going to stone her. So either this is a false report, because if so, where's the man? Or you're either lying or you're being an unfair or an unjust judgment. Verse 2, you shall not follow the crowd in doing evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute. Now, here's the thing. Notice what happens here. After he says this, what does it says? They began leaving one by one, beginning with the older ones, right? So the crowd starts to disperse because you should not be joined in evil, nor should you testify in a dispute so as to join together with a crowd in order to what? Pervert justice. So either this is a false report or this is a perversion of justice. One way or another, either you didn't really catch her, she is an adulterer, and maybe y'all knew that she was an adulterer and you brought her, but there was no actual catching, because if there was a catching, then you forgot to bring the man. So either you're perverting justice or you're lying. Verse 3, nor shall you show favor to a poor person in a deceit, right? So this is potentially what is taking place, right? So the reason that I'm bringing this out is because 2 things are happening, right? Because you can't do this. You can't give a false report and you can't pervert justice. I believe that they're obviously getting ready to, I think they're bringing a false report personally, and they're perverting justice. Either way, though, here's the problem. Now, showed y'all that. Now, let me show y'all the problem. Deuteronomy 17. This is how the law of Moses works together in this conversation. Deuteronomy 17, 6 and 7. On the testimony, well, let's just start verse 4. If it's reported to you and you have heard about it, so this is talking about a sin, a violation being taking place, then you shall investigate it thoroughly. And if it is true and the report is trustworthy that this detestable thing has been done in Israel, then you are to bring out to your gates the man or woman who has done this evil deed. That is, the man or the woman, and you shall stone them to death. Now watch this. On the testimony of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses, the condemned shall be put to death. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of only 1 witness. Now here it is, the hands of the witnesses shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterwards the hands of all the people. So you shall eliminate the evil from your midst. How is the hand of the witnesses going to put him to death? Through stoning. So what is it that Jesus actually says? If you are witnesses, then you throw the stone. Because the law says that the witnesses are supposed to throw the first stone. And then guess what? Everybody that's with you is supposed to follow you. But here's the problem. Remember, going back to Exodus 23, if you are a fictitious or a malicious witness, then guess what you don't want to do? You don't want to throw a stone and kill somebody when you know you didn't witness anything. Right? What is the sin that Jesus is talking about when he says, you who are without sin, throw the first stone? He's saying, you who are not standing here as a malicious witness, bearing false witness, or perverting justice, throw the stone in. You caught her in the act, throw the stone. Right? You ain't bring the man if you're not perverting justice, throw the stone. Why you bringing the woman to me, telling me what you can do? If you are here not under false pretense, if you were here not perverting justice, you throw the stone. When he says you who are without sin, throw the first stone, he is not talking about you are without sin forever in your life. He is saying right now, if you are not a malicious witness, then follow the law of Moses and stone her. Guess what? Because they were malicious witnesses, they walked away. That's what Jesus is talking about in this text. He's not talking about it is improper to use. Let me get it back on the screen. It is improper to use John 8 to become the scapegoat of making it feel like nobody can ever speak a corrective word over your life. Well, if you were without sin, you go ahead. Now, obviously, you can't condemn nobody. Fact. So if you ain't got if you've ever sinned, you got no right to condemn a person unto condemnation. Right. But at the same time, just because you may have had sin or you're imperfect doesn't mean you can't speak a corrective word over somebody's life. So if you are on this live and if you watch this live back at any time in your life, please understand, don't use this verse to justify the fact that you don't want somebody to correct you, because the sin is a very specific sin here. It is not universal sin, all sin for all of your ever life. He's saying in this moment, if you are not a malicious witness and you're not sinning by bearing false report, then cast a stone. Do what the law has told you to do. And the fact that they would not do it means that they were malicious witnesses and they were bearing false witness against this woman, at least in the context of catching her in the act. Because Jesus then tells her, I don't condemn you, go now and do not sin any longer, then clearly Jesus understands that she has committed some sin. Whether it's adultery or he's speaking over her whole life, we don't know. I think she was an adulterous woman. I just don't believe she was caught in the act right then. Because if she was, again, the man should have been there with her and both of them should have been should have been condemned. But that's what Jesus is saying in John chapter 8. I pray that made a whole lot of sense to y'all. Make sure you like, subscribe, follow. Apologetics for You.